In this lecture, we look at the philosophies that begin emerging after the period of modernity. The dates here vary somewhat, but most feel that sometime toward the very beginning of the 20th century is when philosophy really starts to take this turn toward postmodern or post-enlightenment ways of thinking. The two of our most important figures for this kind of philosophy are Ludwig Wittgenstein and also Heidegger. So we'll be looking at those two gentlemen in this lecture.
This little drawing is one of my favorites to introduce sort of a basic approach to postmodern ways of thinking. The drawing that you see here is most often referred to as the dabbit. Depending on the perspective you take as you look at this picture, you are seeing one of two animals. Either you are seeing a rabbit whose ears are projecting off to the left, or you are seeing a duck whose bill is projecting off to the left. And as you look at it closely, I think that you can see how you could either see a rabbit or a duck, but in a sense it's both. It's the dabbit, but the way that your eyes will focus on the picture, you will more readily recognize one than the other. And so as we move into postmodern ways of thinking, what we're trying to understand are these certain biases, these certain presuppositions that we have that cause us to see the world and cause us to view reality in a particular way. Postmodernity thinks that the modern age or the Enlightenment was rather naive in supposing that we could make universal statements that are true for everyone, everywhere, about what objective truth is. Instead, postmodernity will recognize that we all have particular experiences, cultures, genetic makeup, and all of these things and other things have an irrevocable impact on how we perceive and describe our truth and our reality. Postmodernity, I think you can hear with that, is much more subjective than modernity or enlightenment. Now, there have been two primary schools of postmodern thought that have emerged in the early to mid-20th century, and they continue to develop today in the 21st century. One emphasizes the key component of language for philosophy. This is articulated by Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the other is tied to the philosopher Martin Heidegger, and he will focus upon a type of study called phenomenology. I'll say more about what phenomenology is on the last slide of this lecture. Now, both of these schools developed in Europe, but as they have now migrated over to America, we see two particular universities that have advocated one approach or the other. At Yale, we have the Yale School, which will focus more on Wittgenstein's approach that keys in on linguistics. And then also at the University of Chicago, we have more of the phenomenological approach that will follow what began with Martin Heidegger. Okay, here we have Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was actually a student of astrophysics and decided that he wanted to make an attempt at philosophy, and so he wrote a philosophy paper and sent it to probably the most well-known philosopher in England at the time, Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell told Ludwig Wittgenstein that he was far too intelligent for astrophysics, that he needed to be a philosopher. And Wittgenstein, as I've already mentioned, would make linguistics. He would make our words what is most important about doing philosophy. Again, he was initially embraced by the positivist philosophers of England, such as Bertrand Russell, but eventually Wittgenstein would embarrass Russell and some other of his mentors by bringing forth arguments that undercut their philosophical authority. Wittgenstein would make it clear that through language, Russell and others could not possibly know some of the claims that they were making. Again, this is showing you another element of postmodernity, of looking at the philosophies of previous days and sensing a sort of arrogance about it, of thinking that you can know far more than you actually can know. As Wittgenstein continued to mature in his own philosophy, he would move from his first work, a Tractatus, which simply looked at words as being tools of description, modifiers, to describe what you see going on and how important it is to choose the right words to describe what it is that you are seeing. But eventually, when we get to another one of his work, Investigations, we will see that Wittgenstein has now realized that words can function in many different types of ways, not just as descriptions. And to give you one example of that, Wittgenstein, along with others, recognized that words can be performative, such as the phrase here, close the door. By saying close the door, I'm not describing something, but I'm giving an order that you would perform an action. And so the words close the door, if they are obeyed, those words have become performative. An action is going to take place because the words were spoken. Well, now that Wittgenstein has identified various uses for language, he also will be humble enough to admit that language has great limitations. All we are words to describe truth, but words are not sufficient to capture the whole truth, according to Wittgenstein, only a particular glimpse or one side of a truth. Now, rather than identifying this limitation about words as something that would make him fretful and anxious, that he cannot know as much of the truth as perhaps he would like. Certainly, I think we see that with Kierkegaard and his struggle with angst. Wittgenstein instead accepted this as a basic limitation of words, and he is content simply to recognize that limitation, and it is again not something that makes him anxious or worrisome. And now we come to the other approach that we have here in postmodern philosophy, the other major approach. There's certainly more than two. And this is going to be the phenomenological approach of Martin Heidegger. Now, just biographically, one thing that your author was careful to point out about Heidegger is that Heidegger is a very controversial figure because of his ties to the Nazi Party. But one of his pupils, who would become a very well-known philosopher in his own right, Richard Rorty, remarks that a philosopher's character should not be our litmus test, should not be our evaluation of the philosopher's philosophy. And Rorty uses the example of if you were to say that Einstein had particular character flaws, that would not influence the way that you would evaluate Einstein's science. And so it also is not fair to do that to a philosopher. Now, Heidegger's philosopher is deeply indebted on one who came before him, who initially he had a good working relationship with, Edmund Husserl. But Husserl, who was Jewish, certainly over time the relationship between Heidegger and Husserl became very strained with Heidegger's ties to the Nazi Party. Now, Husserl is known as the father of the phenomenological school. And phenomenology has to deal with the fact that as we observe things, we are taking in, we are seeing a particular phenomenon. We are experiencing a phenomenon. And phenomenology has to do with the way that our mind is structured or works to analyze that phenomena and make sense of that phenomena, to make sense of what it is that we are experiencing, observing, or taking in. Now, one thing that Husserl liked to go back all the way to Descartes for was to say that Descartes did recognize how critical thinking is to existence. You remember Descartes, I think, therefore I am. But Husserl said that Descartes did not go far enough, that there is no thinking being that simply exists in thinking in isolation, thinking in a vacuum, but thinking by definition means that they're always thinking about something, that there is always some particular object or some particular idea that is being thought of. So the thinker does not exist in isolation. The thinker is always thinking about something, some phenomena that the thinker is taking in, observing, analyzing, evaluating. Now, Heidegger would take this basic tenet of Husserl's and he would flesh out this phenomenology even more. And I do want you to know the name of his primary text. You cannot talk about Heidegger without talking about the text Being and Time, where Heidegger points out that all of our perceptions and thoughts about the phenomena that we observe, well, all of those things are conditioned by the nature of existence in a particular time and place. And so again, that is a very postmodern tenet of realizing that who we are, where we are, when we are, all these things have, of course, enormous influence on how we observe and analyze and evaluate phenomena. Now, with our philosophers today, they typically will lean toward either Wittgenstein or Heidegger. You will rarely find someone that is an advocate of both. But there is one thing that they have in common I want you to be aware of. The nature of postmodern philosophy in both Wittgenstein and Heidegger have led to, in the present day, philosophy having a much more narrative structure and tone than the more systematic and abstract tone that you've seen in previous generations. You can make a case that seminally this begins a bit with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but it really comes into full swing in Heidegger and Wittgenstein, their writings, and those who come after them, this more narrative approach to doing philosophy.